She sat alone at the train station, clutching a letter that had promised her a new life. He looked at her and said, "You didn't say you were this old," then turned and walked away. By sundown, a stranger offered her something no one ever had. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen it all. First, let's go back to the beginning. The moment hung still, like dust in a sunbeam, as their eyes met across the depot's drafty hush. Her gaze wasn't pleading. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply tired. The kind of tired that came not from travel, but from enduring too much hope and having it break in her hands. Eli shifted, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He didn't move closer, just enough to see her more clearly. The woman in the shawl blinked rapidly and pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to collect herself with the last remnants of dignity. She wasn't hiding her tears. She was simply trying to contain them, keep them neat and private, like everything else about her. The shawl was woolen, worn but clean, the kind passed down from a mother or sister. A loose thread dangled at her elbow. Her suitcase sat at her feet, its leather corners cracked, one of the latches barely holding. A faded monogram had once marked it proudly, but now it was rubbed nearly to nothing. E.R., he guessed at the initials, though it felt wrong to think of her as anything other than a whole person. She had once packed that case with purpose. Now it just held the weight of disappointment. A single paper envelope, yellowed at the edges, peeked from her coat pocket. A letter, no doubt, the kind a woman clutches when she's come a long way for someone's word. Eli had seen it before. Women stepping off trains with expectations, men meeting them with silence, sometimes even with laughter. There was nothing crueler than hope met with coldness. He noticed her shoes next, buttoned boots, neatly polished. She had taken care to arrive presentable, not flashy, but honest. And now she sat like something discarded, not for being broken, but simply not being shiny enough. A porter passed, wheeling a cart. She flinched, not from fear, but from the instinct of someone who's been in the way before. Someone used to apologizing for taking up space. Eli's throat tightened. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He knew that posture, the way shoulders curled when life taught you to brace for impact. He had carried it himself for months after burying Mary. He still wore it most days. He looked away for a moment, chewing the inside of his cheek. Then back, still there, still crying, quietly, still no one coming for her. He exhaled slowly. Somewhere behind him, a train whistle called in the distance, but he stayed where he was, watching. Not out of curiosity, out of something deeper, out of knowing. They walked side by side through the dust-choked street, the kind where loose boards creaked under every footstep and signs swung with the breath of the prairie. Helen's steps were cautious, her suitcase bumping against her leg. Not from clumsiness. There was a poise in her, the kind you don't fake, but from the unsteadiness that comes when your dignity has just been walked out on. Eli didn't press her. He let silence settle like warm bread dough, soft and rising. At the diner, the bell above the door gave a tired ring. A few heads turned, then quickly looked away. Small towns always noticed, and they always remembered. Helen stood just inside the doorway like she wasn't sure if she had the right to be there. Eli nodded toward a booth by the window. "You go ahead," he said, and only then did she sit, smoothing her skirt with fingers that trembled slightly at the edges. A waitress approached, younger than Helen, with eyes that flicked from Eli to his unexpected companion. "2 coffees," Eli said before she could ask. "And stew, if it's warm." "It's warm," the girl replied, almost like a challenge. Eli just nodded. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap, not fidgeting, just still, like someone who'd spent a lifetime learning how not to take up too much space. She looked out the window, past her own reflection. "It wasn't even what he said, you know," she murmured. "It was how fast he said it. Like I'd fooled him. Like he was owed something I failed to be." Eli listened. Really listened. "I'm not ashamed of my years," she added, her voice barely above the din of plates and spoons and quiet chewing. "They've come with cost, with purpose. I nursed my father through 2 winters when his legs failed. I buried my sister after scarlet fever took her in 3 days. I took in my neighbor's boy after she disappeared into a bottle." She paused, swallowed. "I told him all of that, in the letters." Eli's fingers tensed around the rim of his mug. "And still he said, 'Too old.'" She smiled then, but it was a fragile thing, all corners and no center. "He couldn't see that I've lived, only that I'd already lived." Across the table, Eli didn't answer right away, but something changed in his eyes. Like he wasn't just seeing her, he was remembering her, from some other life, some other ache. Like grief had been a shared language they hadn't realized they spoke. The pie sat between them, untouched. Peach, by the smell of it, still warm, with the crust flaking at the edges just so. It was the kind of thing you remembered from a kitchen that no longer existed, the kind of sweetness that came after long days and quiet prayers. But Helen looked at it like it was something from another life, something she didn't deserve to reach for. Eli watched her, his calloused thumb grazing the rim of his coffee cup. He didn't rush. He understood silence like most folks understand speech. He knew when words were wounds and when they were offerings. She sat with her hands folded, the blue shawl slipping from her shoulders slightly. Her eyes were still red from earlier, but the shaking had stopped. There was a stillness to her now, like a candle flame that refused to flicker, even in wind. "I thought," she said, not lifting her gaze, "maybe I'd get a second beginning. Not grand, just something. Someone to say good morning to." Eli nodded, not out of politeness, but because he knew that ache. The ache of empty chairs and unspoken names. "After Mama passed, there wasn't anyone left to need me," she continued. "And I wasn't needed. That's a peculiar kind of loneliness, Eli, when the house goes quiet and not even your hands know what to do anymore." He shifted slightly in his seat, the leather squeaking beneath him. "Needing someone," he said slowly. "That's what scared me after Mary died. I thought I'd used it all up, but it don't run out, does it?" Helen finally met his eyes. For the first time since the station, there wasn't grief in her stare, but curiosity, a cautious kind of hope. "That's what I saw in you," Eli said. "Not sadness, stillness, like a tree that's been through a storm but kept standing. And I figured, maybe I'd like to sit under that tree for a while." The pie between them steamed quietly. "I went to the clerk," he added. "Asked what it'd take to sign the papers." Helen's breath caught. Her hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of something too good to believe. "I'm not a man who says things he don't mean," Eli said, removing his hat. "So if you'll let me, I'd like to walk you out of this day different than you walked in, as my wife." No orchestra played. No crowd cheered. Just the rustle of her shawl as she reached for his hand, and the smallest nod, like a whisper only the heart could hear. The cottonwood above them whispered like it remembered other vows, spoken long before theirs, in years when the bark was smoother and the world seemed newer. Its leaves trembled in the breeze, casting golden shadows that danced across the dirt and across the shoulders of the man and woman standing at its base. 2 figures carved from weathered hope and earned quiet. Eli stood straight, though not rigid. He wasn't a man of ceremony, but he had combed his hair, buttoned his best shirt, and scraped the mud from his boots with care, as if each small act were a tribute. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of miles and seasons, of broken things patched up not to be perfect, but to be whole again. "I can't offer riches," he said, looking not just at her, but into her. "And I won't promise you ease, but I'll share my roof and my coffee, and my silence. I'll speak your name every morning and give thanks that you said yes." Helen didn't cry. Not anymore. Her eyes shimmered, but there was no collapse in her expression. Only fullness. Like someone who had finally been seen by the exact eyes meant to find her. She had chosen to wear the blue shawl, not in defiance of the words that had once wounded her, but in quiet triumph. The same shawl in which she had been rejected was now the one she was marrying in. No transformation. Just truth, accepted at last. She reached into her pocket and handed him the folded paper. It wasn't ornate, just a slip of parchment softened by years and handling. The ink was fading, but the words were etched into her memory like stitching in a quilt. Her mother had read it to her on stormy nights, always with a hand on her hair. And now, Helen gave it to Eli. Not for him to read, but for him to carry. The clerk's wife, a woman with gray streaks in her braid and kindness in her posture, whispered the final blessing with a softness usually reserved for prayer. And then it was done. No one clapped. The moment didn't need it. Eli leaned forward and kissed her. Not with urgency, not with passion, but with steadiness, like placing a stone in the foundation of a home. Behind them, the depot quieted. A dog barked in the distance. The cottonwood shivered once more. And when Helen turned, her hand in his, she whispered the words like they'd been waiting inside her for years. "I'm not too old. I'm just right. For you."